She lived her entire childhood years inside a small bedroom, tied to a potty seat, and was punished for speaking. She is Genie Wiley, the most famous case of a feral child. In November 1970, a woman named Irene Wiley, accompanied by her 13-year-old daughter, known to the world as Genie, went inside the building of the local Los Angeles County Welfare Office. She was seeking services for the blind. After all, she had no vision in one eye, while the other suffered from severe cataracts that resulted in a 90% loss of vision. But Irene had made a mistake. She actually entered the offices of General Social Services. Upon reaching the counter, a social worker noticed Genie's unusual posture and movement. She immediately called for the supervisor, and an investigation ensued. And soon, the world became aware of Genie Wiley, the feral child that suffered unimaginable abuse. Genie Wiley was born to parents Irene and Clark Wiley in 1957 in California. Growing up, Irene had a loving father, but an emotionally distant mother. During her childhood, she slipped and bashed her head on a washing mangle. The impact was so severe, it caused her permanent blindness in one eye and gave her neurological problems that made it difficult for her to live a normal life. As years passed, the situation around her grew desperate, compounded by the Great Depression. Irene made the decision to marry Clark, a man 20 years her senior, for financial stability. It was not a healthy marriage, to say the least. After all, Irene thought her life ended when she married Clark. Despite being a good worker in the aircraft industry, Clark had a host of mental health problems. He was overly protective and confining, and he absolutely did not want children. However, in the 5th year of their marriage, Irene became pregnant with their first child. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl, but within 3 months, the child was dead from pneumonia. It was suggested that Clark left her in the garage because he couldn't stand her crying, causing her to die from exposure. Their second child suffered the same fate, dying of blood poisoning attributed to neglect. Their third child was John, a healthy baby boy who developed slowly because of neglect. Clark's mother, Pearl, took care of him most of the time and was able to turn him normal. Irene and Clark then had a fourth child, a girl believed to be named Susan. She would soon become known to the world as Genie, the feral child. Pearl was too old to care for her, so she was left in the hands of abusive parents. Medical examination reports classified Genie as slow and retarded, a condition they associated with complications from a blood transfusion. The issues arose due to Rh incompatibility, a condition where the mother's immune system produces antibodies against the baby's blood. Clark thought this meant Genie was extremely disabled and had to be protected from the world. When Pearl died in a car accident after taking John outside to buy ice cream, Clark became a recluse, further reinforcing his belief that the outside world was dangerous. He then kept his family mostly inside the house, often sitting during the evenings with a loaded gun on his lap. In his own twisted way, Clark believed he was preserving their safety, unknowingly inflicting upon them the evil he sought to shield them from. Clark relocated his family to his mother's 2-bedroom residence in Temple City, California. He preserved his mother's bedroom as a memorial, forcing the rest of the family to share the living room. All except for Genie. The details of Genie's early life before she was discovered remained somewhat obscure. Nonetheless, the extent of the abuse she endured from Clark was indisputable. She spent most of her life locked inside a small bedroom in the house. It was discovered that Genie had a thick ring of callous skin on her bottom. This was caused by her consistently being tied to an infant's potty seat for days on end. She was only allowed to move her fingers, hands, feet, and toes while the rest of her body was tied tightly, preventing her movement. Sometimes, Genie was moved to a sleeping bag that had been turned into a straitjacket. She was forced to sleep on a wire cot with a wire overhead. Clark hated noise, and he subjected the entire family to torture, preventing them from communicating too much with each other. For fear of annoying him, John and Irene often communicated through whispers. Clark then terrified Jeannie to stop her from making sounds, beating her with a stick oftentimes if she did. Clark barked and growled at her like a dog. It was explained that it was Clark's own twisted way of trying to be her protector, as dogs usually protect the humans around them. Furthermore, he instructed John not to speak to Jeannie too much. As a consequence, Jeannie rarely heard sounds due to her isolation from the world, and learned to be completely silent, suppressing her vocalizations. Her sense of sight was hardly stimulated as well. The room she was in only had 2 windows, both of which were mostly covered with tape, save for a small opening at the top that allowed a little bit of light. Her only view of the outside world was a glimpse of the sky. On rare occasions, Jeannie was permitted to play with 2 plastic raincoats that hung in the room. At times, she was also allowed to look at censored pages from TV guides, while any suggestive pictures were removed by Clark. Aside from these, her only other toys were a handful of empty cotton reels. Jeannie's diet was terrible. Baby food, cereal, and a soft-boiled egg were fed to her through very limited contact. Sometimes, when she would spit or choke, her face would be rubbed in the food as punishment. Jeannie's early life was hell on earth. Eventually, Jeannie's birth doctor told the family that she would not live very long due to a retarded condition, adding that if Jeannie reached the age of 12, they would seek help for her. However, Clark refused to do so, even after Irene begged him for it. A fight broke out, and Clark threatened to kill Jeannie. Irene then decided to take Jeannie and stay at her parents' home. She later decided to seek help for her blindness and ask for welfare payments, but instead got Jeannie discovered. The police transferred Jeannie to the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles to address her severe malnutrition. Meanwhile, Irene and Clark were taken into custody on charges of child abuse. Jeannie was in horrible condition. She couldn't swallow, couldn't cry, was constantly salivating, had 2 nearly complete sets of teeth, couldn't fully extend her limbs, couldn't differentiate hot from cold, could only say "stop it" and "no more." Unsurprisingly, completely terrified of dogs. It was November 20th, 1970, and Clark and Irene were about to make their first court appearance. However, Clark killed himself before the trial began and wrote a note saying, "The world will never understand." At this point, Jeannie's story received immense public attention, so much so that the National Institution for Mental Health funded a research team that consisted of experts James Kent, Susan Curtis, Jay Shirley, and David Rigler to help Jeannie. While doing this, though, they would collect valuable psychological information from her unique case. Kent assessed Jeannie and noticed that she had intense curiosity about sounds, but had underdeveloped motor skills. Despite his optimism about her progress, he recognized severe signs of abuse. Jeannie had a tendency to scratch and scowl, but never voiced her anger. Jeannie behaved like a blind child, holding people's hands to her face. In her early days at the hospital, Jeannie began to dress herself and use the toilet. After 2 weeks, she was introduced to the rehab center's yard and play area. She enjoyed freedom and was not punished for making mistakes, leading to her learning self-expression. Jeannie's social progress included developing a sense of possession, taking daily walks with Kent, and forming attachments to adults. She was showing increasing recognition of Kent over time. She was also making progress on naming objects, gaining a year of development every few months. Jeannie then developed a close attachment to Curtis. While Jeannie's development was beginning to look more optimistic, problems began to show. Jeannie had a teacher at the rehab center named Jean Butler, who took her in for quarantine when she got measles. Through their bonding, Butler began to protest the research team's treatment of Genie, commenting that they were using her as a guinea pig. Under Butler's care, Genie began making drastic improvements, being able to verbalize her anger. Soon, Butler applied to become Genie's foster mother, but the social services denied this, forcing Genie to return to the rehab center. After all, Butler worked in the hospital, and it was against policy to put patients in the homes of the hospital's employees. Still, Genie ended up living with David Rigler, another employee of the Children's Hospital. Under Rigler's care, Genie was subjected to exposure therapy and eventually made improvements in her immense fear of dogs. By 1972, Genie's linguistic developments had reached their peak. She was never able to form more than 2 words in a sentence. And in the cases that she did, it would be an incoherent mixture of words, like Monday Curtis come, turning to Monka. The researchers then decided to involve Irene in Genie's life, strengthening their relationship as they deemed it was crucial to Genie's development. Irene remained involved and improved her home for Genie's visits. Unfortunately, in 1974, the National Institute for Mental Health defunded Genie's research because they couldn't produce much progress. Genie returned to her mother's care at age 18, but ended up in a foster home due to Irene's inability to care for her, even after her cataracts were removed and her vision was repaired. Multiple foster home placements were detrimental to her progress and mental health. One foster home tried to manually extract her constipation with an ice cream stick, further traumatizing her. Genie stopped speaking for 5 months. Another foster home punished Genie for vomiting, threatening to never allow her to see Irene again. Genie then stopped eating and speaking until she was hospitalized. Genie expressed a longing for the Riglers and her mother, feeling that her frequent relocations were punishment for being a bad girl. Curtis, her first language therapist, was her only stable connection. She wrote a book on Genie, explaining the nature of language learning processes. Post-publication, Irene sued Curtis and other parties for violating confidentiality, alleging extreme testing conditions on Genie. Irene lost, with the defense claiming Genie enjoyed and benefited from the research. After the lawsuit, a still upset Irene hid Genie from the world, placing her in a home for mentally challenged adults. As of 2008, Genie was now a ward of the state and 51 years old, lived in her 6th foster home. She never learned to speak again. Her current condition and whereabouts are unknown. Genie's life was filled with cruelty, abuse, and suffering. While attempts to fix her condition were successful due to the high-profile nature of the case, she became more of an experiment as people who had vested interests in her case became involved. Ever since 2008, there have been no news or updates on Genie's health and condition. As we reflect on her story, our only hope is that she's experiencing peace and safety in her current circumstances, finally free from the torment of her past. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications by activating the bell icon. By doing so, you'll never miss out on new content, and it really helps us make these videos. So, like, subscribe, and activate the bell. We appreciate your support.